Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. And you know what? What we're doing today is exploration, right? And the lady who we have on, I say this every week, but she is a pioneer. Right? She is someone who I've longed to have a conversation with about her journey. And I'm just so glad that she's able to be with us. And her name is Julie Makani. And Julie is, let me just, she is the one of the provost's visiting professors, and she's a professor of hematology, and she's the principal investigator of the Sickle Cell Pan-African Research Consortium. I'm gonna just go into it because Julie, I've admired you from afar. So I'm gonna just say, let's get on with it and find out my first question. So Julie, my first question always is, can you tell us about what it is that gave you your sense of identity, sense of belonging as you were growing up?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell. First of all, thank you very much for having me and inviting me. I was looking through the previous interviews, and you have just done a tremendous job of interviewing amazing people. So thank you for inviting me. So sense of belonging, I think growing up and as a child, as an adult, and I think growing up, you still continue changing with time. So there's no time limits to growing or growing up. But the sense of belonging, where or how did I develop it? I think with hindsight, I think of it as always being very aware of being slightly different. So whether I was at primary school or whether I was at secondary school, university, working, I always used to be very aware of what was different about me and the people and the environment around me. But then it also made me flip it and look at it the other way around. Rather than look at what was different about me, it was to look at what was similar about me and the people around me. And so I think belonging is a really good sense. Now, whether it was at boarding school, I went to boarding school very early on at primary school, and it was a Greek Orthodox boarding school in Arusha, in Constantine. And at that time, as a young Black African Tanzanian, we were the minority in the school. So it was very interesting learning. And I don't know whether it was at that stage or when I went to now, like my high school, the high school that I went when I was doing my A levels. This is where we were in a girls' school. And again, here, I felt different because I had had my primary education in a English medium school, and in Tanzania, the language of instruction is or communication, I should say, is Kiswahili. And so again, feeling and looking and being aware of the differences that I had with my colleagues, my classmates, but then also the similarities. And I think one of the things that I remember very clearly in the lobby of the school that I was at, there was a great um, photograph print of the first president of Tanzania. This is President Nyerere. And there was a quotation that he had made. I think it was at a university, at a graduation from the University of Dar, or when he was talking about education. And it was really saying, I paraphrase, that if you have been given privileges, and education is a privilege, if you've been given education, you have a responsibility to give back to the people that gave you that education. And so I think that was another time point that I look back on and think that's again made me always be aware of belonging and my sense of self, because you think, okay, so who gave me this opportunity? and how do I give back to that person? Yeah. So yeah.
There was a couple of things which you said in that you said that you were aware of your differences, but then you looked to find out what was our similarities. How did you come to that way of thinking? You were aware of your differences. So what kind of things did you say, I'm different based on this, based on that, based on this? And why then did you say, well, let's see what's more similar about us?
So I think it's and I think this is something that I have developed probably over time, is
Mm-hmm.
that when you're having conversations or when you're trying to understand whether you're new or old or trying to do something different, more often than not, people tend to focus on the differences
Mm-hmm.
between you and them.
Mm-hmm.
And so my thinking is that if you focus on the differences, then you will never find common ground. You will never be able to identify things that are similar that can make you come together. And so, and sometimes, of course, when I'm having these conversations, whether it's at work or whether it's with friends or family, sometimes, I get teased a little bit because they say that's a little bit of a reach trying to say, look at the similarities between us. But I think, as human beings, as communities, as academic scientists, people, I think we want to work together. And in order for us to work together, it's really appreciating the things that make us similar and also recognizing and valuing the things that make us different.
So let me ask another question then, because I understand that. I do see where you're coming from in terms of
Mm.
sometimes we make differences which potentially form to divide us instead of thinking about the things which we can do, which actually unites us together. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
so in that sense, um, going to the different schools and stuff and being a woman, what was it about science that captured your attention? Was that your favorite subject, or was that the one which you were encouraged most to do? What was it?
I think so I think there are two questions there,
Yeah,
Wayne. One is about being a woman, and then the
yeah,
other one is about being a scientist.
yeah.
And I think, let me start with science. That, being a scientist, is that one of the amazing things about science or being a science is that it's global.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing. If you see yourself as a scientist, if you are a scientist, then you, it does not matter. That's really a sense of who are you. You're a scientist, and it doesn't matter,
Hmm.
what level, whether you're a primary school student or teacher, or whether you're a professor, you're a scientist. And I think that's something that I think is really important. And for me, that's another sense of belonging, where I feel that that's a community that I can say I'm a scientist. And it's been very interesting because I trained as a medical doctor,
Hmm.
which was my first degree. And that's another thing that I identify with as being a doctor and being a physician and being a member of the medical community or healthcare community.
Hmm.
And that's a second sense. And again, working and trying to navigate these two things as a clinical academic has always meant that you're trying to tell the clinicians or the people working in the healthcare sector that I want to be part of you, although I'm a scientist, because they, at times they would look at me and not see me as a doctor, but they would see me as a scientist. So kind of convincing them that actually I do belong to this group. And then the
Hmm.
same thing on the other, in the scientific community, where you would look and you would say, but you're not a real scientist
Hmm.
because you're doing too much clinical work or you're doing too much this. And so it's really trying to say, you're right, I'm not this, that, a pure this or a pure that, but let's look at the similarities. And so those are the two kind of groups that I say. And then of course the groups that I have been born into to a certain extent is being Black, is being African, is being Tanzanian, and is being a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And those are identities that or communities or groups that I am a part of. And yeah. So I'll stop there and maybe.
No, that's I like the way that you spoke about those different groupings and how you transit, or how you kind of like bridge, kind of like you're almost like a go-between, a conduit, going from one group and you're saying, I do belong here, go to another group, I do belong here, and you're bringing that level of connection, so you don't necessarily then see people saying, I'm only of one group, I'm only of the other group. You combine the two.
It's very interesting. You use that word connection because it's a word that my husband Abdu says
Yeah.
when we've got three daughters.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he would always tell them is the importance of being connectors.
Yeah.
And if you come from one community or one society or one class within a society, um, you have a responsibility of trying to find ways of connecting with another community, whether it's from a perspective of religion or faith, whether it's a perspective of socioeconomic class or education. It's being it's putting yourself and looking at things as a way of connecting different groups.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think the one thing that we often make a mistake is wanting to put people in one particular group. So so that's one aspect. Are you this or are you that?
Yeah.
And saying, so that's one aspect. I think the other aspect is there's a tendency of trying to say that you can't be this if you're that.
Yeah.
So again, that comes from a perspective, I think, of exclusion or uh, exclusion, or kind of like creating that sense of other, saying no, if you're part of this, then if you're a scientist, then you can't be a doctor. If you're a Christian, if you're a Christian, then you can't be a Muslim. If you're, it's that perspective. If you are an academic, then you can't be a patient advocate, and it's that whole thing of saying, actually, it's not that black and white. Yeah.
Absolutely. I really like that, kind of like that exclusion inclusion piece, kind of like the in group, the out group, othering of individuals, which so often affects people's sense of belonging, right? If you're othering them, you're saying that you can't belong to where to what I belong to. So I do like that connectivity that we have to maintain. So what was it that got you then interested in, because you mentioned about the fact that you're a medical doctor. What was it that got you interested in the likes of sickle cell and those kinds of those kind of diseases, and the area of and hematology, I should say?
Yeah, so I think with when you train as a doctor, you train across the whole spectrum of major areas or major disciplines, and I found it always easier to kind of be very clear what I did not want to do.
Okay.
And that, to a certain extent, it was clear that as you're training, okay, you love this particular subject, and this subject you don't love as much or you hate.
Mhm.
So yeah, when I was making choices, it was using a combination of both. I do not like this, or I'm not good at this, or I'm not interested, and I'm good at this, and this is what is drawing me. And I think in terms of the so I, after I qualified from Muimbili University, which is where I
Mhm.
work as well, I knew that what I wanted to do was internal medicine, as work in medicine, in the Department of Internal Medicine as a specialty. And there's certain disciplines that I wasn't very good at, whether it's surgery. I felt no, I didn't have the stamina or the interest in kind of standing for long periods of time, which is what you need to do when you're operating. I knew that I wasn't able to do obs and gyn because of various reasons. I knew that with pediatrics, it's interesting because I knew I did not want to do pediatrics. But then I've ended up working in sickle cell disease, looking after children with sickle cell
Yeah.
disease as well. But the thing that as an intern working in pediatrics at Wimbili as an intern there, I think I had one instance where I just had a lot of deaths, and
Right.
I just was not able to deal with that in
Yeah.
children. And I think at that time I had just had Abdu and I had just had our first child, and so it was very difficult for me to dissociate myself
Yeah.
with this pain and suffering you're seeing in children and the parents and myself as a parent.
Yeah.
So I that was the one aspect. I think the other thing about sickle cell disease is that um, it's very common in Tanzania. So we're the fifth country in the world with the highest birth prevalence of sickle cell disease. So it's the sickle cell trait, or the having the sickle gene is a good thing in our environment because it protects you against getting severe malaria. But it's a bad thing because if you have both genes, then
Yeah.
you have the disease, and then therefore you're at risk of dying from the complications. So in the area where I come from in Tanzania, I was born in Dar es Salaam, but my father came from an area around Lake Victoria, and there is the highest reported birth prevalence of sickle cell disease in Tanzania. And so a lot of people in my family, in my community, have either the trait or the disease.
Right.
So there's also a very kind of family aspect to it.
Yeah.
Seeing people who have the disease and seeing the kind of the loss when they die from sickle cell disease. So that's from a personal perspective. From a professional perspective, I think sickle cell disease is one, and obviously I'm biased, but I think it's one of the most amazing conditions. It
Mhm.
is, the first quote unquote genetic disease that was described.
Mhm.
It is a very, very quote unquote simple disease. And now with gene therapy, it's a model disease because it's a disease where you can say that this is a genetic disease caused by a single gene mutation, and this is what it causes. And from a research perspective, you have a mutation that is able to present itself in a completely different manner, with some people having very, very severe forms of the disease and dying early, and others who have mild disease and don't even know that they have sickle cell disease if
Yeah.
they're not tested. And yet the mutation is quote unquote the same.
The
So
same.
from a scientific perspective, it's like, why is that? You can have a family of three people with the same quote unquote mutation, and
Mhm.
yet they have very, very severe manifestations of the disease and presentations of the disease. So that's from the understanding, why is that, as a
Mhm.
scientist. So I've really interested in that. From the perspective of gene therapy, it's like, if we're able, one, to, and people have done that now, demonstrate that you can actually treat sickle cell disease and quote unquote cure it with gene therapy. Then the next step is, how do you do it, in in trials? How do you do it so that it becomes accessible to many people? How do
Mhm.
you do it so that it's not associated with the potential side effects that gene therapy and other interventions can cause? And so that's my my interest. Yeah.
You unpacked a lot in those few. That was just amazing because the idea of this single cell gene, this single cell mutation, but having that variability in expression and the way it manifests, and trying to understand that, but also, as you've kind of like alluded to and actually shown at the end, there is potentially a curative, something that could cure it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I know you in the consortiums that you're working in and working on. How do we get to the stage then where sickle cell isn't viewed as this debilitating disease as it currently is, but it's viewed as something which is, you know, we've got a cure for that one. Okay, you've got that. There's no, you know, your life expectancy, etc. How do we get there? I know that's a, if you knew the answer, I'm just gonna ask you. How do we get there?
I think no, I think it's the answer to that question, Wayne, is really based on your series. It really is about um, belonging to a community.
Mhm.
So the thing that I try and articulate as or say as much as possible is really that sickle cell disease is unique. Sickle cell disease is very specific in the way the mutation is, in the manifestation, in the geographical distribution, in the ethnic distribution. It's very unique and specific. And I think if we're to find solutions and only look in those groups, we're not going to find a solution. So rather than look at it and say, sickle cell disease is very different from cancer, or very different from HIV, or very different from cystic fibrosis, or infectious disease. Yes, you're absolutely right. All these conditions are very, very different in sickle cell. But then rather than look at, and again, look at it and say, this is different and unique and special, it's to look and you say, and to say, what are the things that are similar in sickle cell disease with other conditions? Because again, by doing that, it means that we are not, we as a sickle cell community, whether it's patients or it's healthcare providers or it's scientists, we are not going to be, we're going to be looking for similarities with other groups and learn from them. And the other way around as well, you know, they can learn from us so that they can say, okay, this is what you did really well. And this is what we did very well. So let's exchange experiences and knowledge so that we move forward as a community or as a society. And I think that's one of the things that's really, so there's an initiative called the Global Gene Therapy Initiative that that I'm privileged to be a part of. It was started maybe 3-4 years ago, and it's the conversations, you know, when people are asking about is like, what is the similarity, or what sickle cell disease and HIV are very, very different conditions. One, you know, and you can just list all the things that are different about these two conditions. But the reality is that there are also quite a lot of similarities.
Mhm.
So if we approach, whether it's things scientifically or things from an academic perspective, and say, what are the similarities between the two? And then what are the ways that we can learn? I think that's where, that's the point where, as scientists, as healthcare providers, as communities, we can make really big advances or progress. Yeah.
So it, I'm liking what I'm hearing. If I'm hearing correctly, you're saying that actually by focusing on both the similarities and differences, and actually not being exclusionary and saying because you're cancer, I can't learn anything because I'm in sickle cell, or because you're HIV, I can't learn something because I'm in, I don't know, some other disorder. Looking at it from that perspective, which is exclusionary, we're then not being able to gain best practice and
Absolutely.
understand that the human body is, it's very much there's intersecting values which occur.
Exactly. Exactly.
So can I, for my education and for the education of our listeners, can you give us a little sense about the stuff which you are actively doing? You gave us a little bit in terms of the Global Gene Therapy Initiative. What other things are you doing to develop and to help to bring sickle cell research and curative nature or curative practices in Africa and beyond?
So thank you. So sickle I'm part of a consortium called Sickle in Africa. And
Mhm.
it's a consortium that we have two coordinating centers, one in South Africa, which coordinates the data, and another one in Tanzania, which coordinates the clinical aspect of things.
Mhm.
So I'm involved with the clinical coordinating center in Tanzania.
Mhm.
And then we work in 8 countries, so South Africa and Tanzania are the countries where the coordinating centers are. And then there's Ghana, Mali, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, 7 countries that are actively engaging and enrolling patients with sickle cell. We've created a registry of over 20,000 individuals with sickle cell disease.
Mhm.
And the target is 34,000. And this is probably going to be one of the largest
Mhm.
multi-country, multi-site registries, because in some countries, such as Nigeria, which is led by Professor Obi Nodu, we have, she's enrolling patients from 25 sites within the country. And Nigeria is the first, is the country with the highest prevalence of sickle cell in the world.
Right.
So that's something. And as a network, what we're doing is, again, trying to say, if we come together and work as a consortium, work as a network, we can learn from each other, and we can leverage our expertise and experience. And so we're developing, and we have developed the infrastructure that will then be used to conduct research with a very clear aim of improving the health and the lives of people with sickle cell disease. So we have a very active engagement with the patient community as well, to make
Mhm.
sure that they are part of the process and not just participants of the research.
Mhm.
The other area that I work in, or the other, is GGTI, which I mentioned, which is the Global Gene Therapy Initiative. And the current priority for GGTI is gene therapy for sickle cell and HIV in Africa.
Mhm.
And so this is, in 2019, the NIH and the Gates Foundation invested $100 million each to um, conduct, to support scientists to conduct research to um, develop interventions that would lead to cure for
Mhm.
sickle cell and HIV. And this is using either gene therapy or cell-based therapy.
Mhm.
And so the thing that struck us as GGTI, and even the funders, the Gates Foundation and the NIH, was that there was a lot of work that was being done in Africa. There was a lot of work that was being done outside of Africa. But when you looked at countries and investigators working on gene therapy in Africa, there were none. There were several clinical trials. This is specifically for gene therapy for sickle cell disease and HIV. When you looked at the number of clinical trials in gene therapy for sickle cell disease, I think now there are over 10 trials that are ongoing. None of them are in Africa, where the burden of disease is. And so Africa and India. And so one of the things as GGTI that we are working to do is to say, how do we conduct research, not just the gene therapy trials, but the fundamental research that will um, bring us closer to that stage of having these therapies available in our countries. So that's the GGTI. Now, another aspect of it, of work that we're doing, as again, this is we in the royal sense,
Yeah.
is that we're working very closely with policymakers, governments, global, because we need to make sure that whatever it is that we're doing does not end up just being a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year research project. It ends up, one, integrating with um, government and country policies. And secondly, it becomes sustainable. And thirdly, it actually has an impact on the people with sickle cell disease. And so whilst we're conducting research on genomics or on gene therapy, we also have to make sure that we are supporting the implementation of things that we know work. And these can be very, very simple things like, quote unquote, simple things like newborn screening for sickle cell disease, which here in the UK is almost standard of care, where everybody who has who's Black or has their child screened for sickle cell disease. But we also want to make sure that they have that the sickle cell population has access to medicines, access to preventative medicines, access to interventions that we know work, disease-modifying medicines such as hydroxyurea, interventions such as red cell exchange, and transplant, because transplant is curative. So this is bone marrow transplant, which is curative. And it's available here in the UK. It's available through the NHS, and they have their system in place. Why is it that we cannot have? And then I think this we talked about this at some stage. This goes back to the whole thing about why do Black people not donate blood, not registered to be part of the donor registry for organs or for bone marrow. And I think it's really to try and encourage the community to kind of donate blood, register to be blood donor, bone marrow transplant registries, and then encourage the community to say, you know, this is actually, there are a lot of complications that may be associated with an intervention, whether you're taking paracetamol or aspirin, or you're participating in or you're receiving bone marrow transplant. There is always a risk for complications and side effects, but we often outweigh the benefits with outweigh the risks with the benefits that people have. Yeah.
Again, there were so many things. There was one thing which I wanted to stop you, but you were in the flow. So I said, I'm not. There was one where you mentioned about the fact that when they looked at the amount of clinical research which was being done in Africa, right, it wasn't necessarily being done by Africans. Was I hearing correctly?
No. So one step further is that there were no clinical trials. So there are no gene therapy trials for sickle cell disease in Africa. No, none.
Zero.
Yeah.
Just a minute ago, I'm just looking back at my notes now. First of all, you said that in Tanzania has got the 5th highest population of individuals with sickle cell. And then as you were going through and you said Nigeria has the highest population. Yeah. So 2 countries, both in Africa, and yet we don't have a clinical trial there.
Yeah. It's shocking, isn't it? So there'll be many reasons why that is. In the same way that 20 years ago, there were very few. There were very few research studies on sickle cell disease happening in Africa. So 20 years, I say 20 years ago, because 2003 was when we started our research study at Muhimbili. So 20 years ago, there weren't. There were very few. Right now, when you look, there is a lot more. We're still not where we should be. We would really want to have a lot more research studies and health programs, but we're getting there. And so I tend to kind of be a little bit optimistic about things. And so it's been frustrating that there aren't any clinical trials for gene therapy. And you will get, again, going back to the whole ethos of belonging, or how the reasons are there. So people will say, well, we can't do, you can't participate in a gene therapy trial because you don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then again, going back to what we were saying before, it's really that whole thing of exclusion, of saying, okay, but you know what I have? I have this. And as you mentioned, one obvious thing is that we have a huge sickle cell population.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that we have. And the flip side to that is that if you're able to get, and I shouldn't say if, when we're able to find a cure that is accessible, cheap, available, easy to administer for using gene therapy for sickle cell disease, 80% of the population are in Africa or and India. And therefore, we need to be thinking now, because it's not a matter of will we get the cure, it's a matter of when will we get the cure and how will we make it available and accessible to all the people who need it. And so we need to think about that now and work in the countries that have the majority of the disease. And so that's and again, it's that whole thing of looking at convergence. And then in terms of creating or developing, and I think this is something that has to do with whether it's belonging or being at Imperial here, it's really to say there is a gap. There aren't enough women, there aren't enough Black people who are working in academia at a particular kind of level. So we say that is fact. How do we address that gap? So the same way with gene therapy in sickle cell disease in Africa is to say, okay, there are no trials at the moment. How do we address that point? What is it that we need to put in place to participate in gene therapy trials, to understand the population who have the condition so that we can then make them. And the nice thing about this is that as you are putting in place the infrastructure, as you're training people for gene and cell therapy, you are, and of course there's an aspect of it that's got to be intentional, you are also developing capacity and you're developing infrastructure to treat patients now with what is available.
Yeah.
And so I think it's I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, 3 to 5 years ago, in countries south of the Sahara, I don't like the term sub-Saharan as a term, but in countries below the Sahara, in Africa, there were only 2 countries which had bone marrow transplant facilities, and bone marrow transplant is important for not just sickle, but for other hematological conditions. So it was only Nigeria and South Africa that had bone marrow transplant units. Now Tanzania has 2 bone marrow transplant units invested by the government. And we're hoping that other countries as well, particularly the countries that are part of Sickle in Africa and other countries, will also be able to do that. Why? Because bone marrow transplant is an intervention that is available, recommended. We have evidence now that says that it's safe and it's getting better, especially with matched sibling donors. And so it means that the more transplant facilities there are, Africans don't have to leave the continent to go and get the transplant elsewhere, which is what is happening now. So they can get the transplant in the countries or within Africa. Yeah. And then that same transplant unit can now be a platform for research. Yeah. Because the current gene therapy is for sickle cell disease is ex vivo, meaning that you need, to a certain extent, it's like a type of transplant, yeah, auto transplant, yeah, because you take out the cells, the hematopoietic stem cells, modify them, and then put them back in. So that's so you're able, and that's one of the things in terms of the program that we're in, is that we feel that we need to integrate the healthcare and the research, not looking at it again separately and saying, oh no, we need to do this first, and then no, integrate and saying, okay, we integrate, make sure that we are optimizing and making sure we provide the best sickle cell services. We are making sure that we're participating in research, not just as sample collectors or field whatever, but we're actually involved in the intellectual aspect of it as well. And then the third is the patient community is part and parcel of the process. And then we're training people, because it's a reality. There will not be enough hematologists, pediatricians, sociologists, counselors. And so we have to engage. And this is I think one of the great things about Muhimbili or Imperial, is that you're not just doing one thing. you're teaching, and at the same time you're doing research. You know, we participated yesterday or with the patient forum. So this is the Hammersmith Hospital had a patient forum where, so it's really having an integrated approach to activities, and integrated is inclusive. It's inclusive, because you're saying, right, how do we do that? You know, all these 5 or 6 things that everybody has their own priority, but how do we integrate them in a way that we can support each other, in a way that we're not competing, in a way that the activities complement each other? Yeah.
There was, again, oh, my mind just go, whoa, whoa, whoa. But one of the things which came to mind as you were talking was the importance of the knowledge transfer, the ability to share from your experience, the ability to say, well, this is what we found, this is what we're investigating, and to be an open community as opposed to having closed sections. When we close off and you say, well, I have the knowledge, but in order for you to get the knowledge, you have to pay me X, Y, Z and whatever else, or you have to do this and whatever. So you remove that transactional element, and you make it, as you said, more integrated, more inclusive. All right.
It's interesting. Sorry, Wayne, as you're talking about the transactional aspect, I think one way of looking at it is looking at it from a quote unquote negative perspective. But again, let's look at it from a positive perspective, in that we need, for people to do something, they have got to see the value of that activity to them. And so one can look at it and say, oh, that's transactional. Why are you looking at things only from the perspective of what do you gain from it, or what is, you know, what's in it for you? But the reality is that if you want to have successful partnerships, every partner should be able to see the benefit that that partnership has to themselves, or to their community, or to their quote unquote tribe. And so I think that's something that, again, it's really important, you know, and when you're having these conversations, depending on when, maybe with the patient community, is that if it's introducing a new intervention, whether it's starting a new research study, starting a new course, there's got to be clarity with what is in it for me as an individual, whether it's as a clinical academic, as a patient, as a department, as a university, as a country. Because, you know, when we talk to the leadership in Tanzania, they will ask very simple questions. What is the value for us as a country, for us to invest in that? If you ask a patient, and so one of the things that I feel I should mention is that I'm also working with Genomics England, who started a sickle cell initiative here in England. And I think the question here is that if we want to have conversations and we want to have quote unquote buy-in, there's got to be an aspect of it that looks at it from a transactional perspective, in that if I want to be part of a project or an activity, what is in it for me? What is in it for the patient? What is in it for the nurse? Because everybody is, you know, as a patient, you're suffering from the disease. So what will make me participate in a study if I do not see the benefit for me? Indirectly, I mean, there are all these issues about you know, kind of research ethics, etc. But you've got to be able to think about these things, and expecting people to just be altruistic. It's not easy if you are in pain, or if you're unable to have a steady job because of frequent hospitalizations. And so I think it's important to think about it from a pragmatic perspective of saying, what's in it for you? when you want to do things. Yeah.
I just put a message in the post. If anyone has any question, then put their hand up. And I'm just seeing hands flying up left, right, and center. If you don't ask, you don't get. So I'm gonna go with Brother William. William, you have a question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Makani. Yeah.
So, William, if it's okay, just say a little bit about yourself before you ask the question.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm a senior lecturer in Black and Community Geographies at Birkbeck College, University of London. Yeah, so my question is, you mentioned that that it's not happening in Africa, sickle cell, the gene therapy. I'm wondering, where is the cutting edge work? Where is it taking place? And is it expensive in those places? So is it readily transferable? What do you think will happen to kind of make it transferable?
Great questions, William. And I can tell you that there is overlap between geography and sickle cell. So, the clinical trials, I think most of them are happening in the US. The first trial that was published, this was funded by Bluebird Bio from an industry perspective, and it was conducted and led by Jean-Antoine Ribéi, and the senior investigator was Marina Cavazzana. So this was done in France. And they published that, and this was one of the first studies with successful gene therapy using the Bluebird Bio vector. Now, so there are different types of gene therapy approaches, and therefore there are different types of gene therapy trials that are ongoing. So predominant in the US. Here in the UK, I know of trials that are looking at the BCL11A gene editing, and they published a paper, I think 2 years ago now, and Imperial, as a matter of fact, with Professor Josu de la Fuente, who was at St. Mary's, was one of the PIs for that study. So we did have people here. The reasons, and obviously in Europe. I think in South America, there may also be studies, not in India, I know, in terms of gene therapy for sickle cell, that there aren't any. Why? I think they're infrastructure reasons, they're HR personnel reasons, but there's also a perception issue that's saying, no, this is too complicated, it can't be done in Africa. Or have you ever done XYZ, therefore you can't do it. And my question has always been, well, up until 10 years ago, some hospitals were not doing transplants, but this is something that they learned. Some hospitals were not doing gene therapy participating, but they learned. So, if we can learn to do it at Imperial, we can learn to do it at Muimbili. So this is just a process that we go through, and we just identify what needs to be put in place, and we put that in place. I think you had another question in terms of the cost, it's at the moment, gene therapy as an intervention will cost $1.2 to $1.8 million. So it's not practical for anyone in any country in the world. And so that is something, it's a conversation that has to have to continue as to how do we reduce the costs, how do we make it more accessible, because it's not realistic. And I think this is why there's a lot of interest in having in vivo gene therapy, because if we're able to address the technological issues around in vivo delivery of the gene, the vector that will then modify the gene, then it means that we don't have to, it'll just be an injection, and we don't have to do the quote unquote mini transplant, which has its requirements. So I think the cost issue is an issue that is a global issue. The resources in terms of infrastructure, including people, that's something that is addressable, that can be addressed. Yeah. Thanks. That was a great question, William.
I've got another question from Sarah. and then Safia. Sarah?
Hi, Julie. So thank you so much. It's been great hearing from you today. And apologies, I got in at 2 a.m. last night, so I'm hoping my thoughts make sense. So I'll just say the comments that you were making earlier are kind of the questions that I want to address or start to address in my, my thing's down, in my fellowship. So I'm the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Research Fellow for the Faculty of Medicine here at Imperial. And it's kind of like my three main questions that I'm looking at is the racial inequality within kind of research careers, seeing people not making it through kind of the research pipeline at all, the gender inequality where we're not seeing women making it up into the leadership positions. And then the third part of it is the fact that is this lack of diversity within our researchers and our leadership leading to a lack of diversity in the research that we're conducting and also who we're reaching out to be part of research studies. So it's kind of what you were saying. It's just like, yes, this is what I'm looking into. And so my kind of question to you sort of is also kind of following on from what you were saying about successful partnerships. So you're a Imperial provost visiting professor. So how do you feel kind of this is going to be beneficial for you and for Imperial, and kind of, is this a good scheme? What can be done better, etc.?
Sarah, this is really, really good. I'm hoping that I'll be able to meet up with you during the course of the time. So Wayne, we're relying on you to.
Yeah, that's I'm working on that. Don't worry.
Great. So I think so one of the things I when I finished my training in Tanzania, I came to Imperial as a DIM student at that time. So I was a DIM student, and it was very disconcerting because you'd have, young doctors coming up to you and asking, "Are you a DIM student?" And you'd have to say yes. So DIM was diploma in internal medicine, and obviously for them it was a quote unquote funny joke. Not so funny, obviously, when you're on the other side, but hey, that's the way it was. So I was a DIM student, and then I worked as an SHO here. So that was in 1996 and 97 and 98, yeah. So 2.5 years on and off, yeah, as a DIM student and then as an SHO. And so coming back now is just very interesting, because now I'm coming back as not as a junior doctor or a DIM student. I'm coming back as a professor. So it's a very different perspective, because you're in the same place, but you're looking at it from a different perspective. And this was an experience that I had even in that year that I was here, where there was that switch from being a DIM student, where you're considered to be very low on the rung, to being an SHO. And at that time, I don't know whether that's the case here, being an SHO at the Hammersmith was very quote unquote prestigious at that time. So it's great being back. I was talking to a couple of people the other day, that I feel that this scheme is really, really good, mainly because I don't have to stay here long term. So, and this is important because it's when I was processing my sabbatical leave from Wimbili to come here, people were asking, "Are you really going to come back? Are you really going to come back?" And then being here, I'm now here. It's my 5th month, I think, of 12. The question is, are you going to stay? And the answer is no. I'm not going to stay, and I'm going to go back to Tanzania. And this was, again, very similar to the way things were 25 years ago, because the thinking was that, why are you leaving Imperial? You're already on a trajectory to kind of like really, establish a clinical scientific career here in the UK. Why on earth are you going back to Tanzania where there's nothing in the area that you want to work in? And I think one of the advantages, and there is an element of truth. So last week I was chatting to Tanzanians who are in the diaspora and kind of listening to how the kind of difficult decisions that people sometimes have to make with regards to staying in one particular country or leaving their home country. So I think I think that the PVP, the Provost Visiting Professorship, is really good because it allows what I consider brain circulation. So what I'm hoping will happen is that this will not just be me coming here and then going back and then that's the end of it, but it'll really mean, it'll be a program that means you have a team of people coming here for short periods, long periods of time, and also the other way around, people from here going to Tanzania or from Imperial going to Muhimbili, or from the UK going to Tanzania, so that you have that exchange of knowledge, of experience, of expertise. And so you have an element of that, whether it's with undergraduate students coming here and studying, or postgraduate students, but you don't have a lot of schemes like this where it's senior level. And I think the other thing as well that's happening now, and it would be very interesting to have a further discussion about this, is that with this what's the word? With this recognition that there isn't adequate diversity at senior level and in leadership, there's been active headhunting in institutions in Africa. And I think that is something that we need to look at and recognize that it may be good for an institution to say, I have headhunted and I have employed a professor of mathematics, and they are Black women, but then if they have recruited that person from an institution in Ghana or in Cameroon, then you're creating brain drain. Yeah. And so we need to think of a way of, and this is, I guess, a bigger kind of question or picture, think of a way of doing it in a way that you support internally, i.e. in the UK or in Imperial, the development of diversity upwards, and you bring it in, but then you also have to be mindful of this risk of brain drain. Yeah.
Yeah, very good response. Because yeah, that's kind of the challenge here, because when people are asking me, because I want to kind of look at the research pipelines, I'm not looking at students. I want to start with that research pipeline. And so looking at who I'm going to be going out and speaking to, well, actually the few numbers that I can find here, actually a lot of them are actually African born, foreign born, not UK system based. And there's the kind of the two issues, the lack of total numbers from wherever you are, but then also the lack of UK born as well. So it's, when we look at, okay, but who do we have? Then actually our professors are often African born that we have here. So it's marrying the two, making sure we're not just sucking away and having the brain drain, but bringing everybody up.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
I think there is also the risk for if you come from outside, is that it may not address the fundamental problem. That's because right. the problem is there because there is a glass ceiling that is preventing people from coming up. So that needs to be addressed. Bringing in people from outside may be a short-term solution, but the long-term solution is to identify, to say, how do we get research fellows into the system? So I'm really excited because, you know, Mary, who is just finished her master's in health, is it health research and art? And she's, you know, honorary fellow. And I'm hoping that, I don't know, by being here, by being inclusive, we can just increase the numbers at different levels. Mm-hmm. Whether it's Mary, who's just finished her master's, or people like Dr. Norris, who's a clinical fellow, you know, and just bring in people at different levels, and just say, there is a problem, you know, women, where are the women? What are the things that are making you not think about pursuing a career? Can you have children? Can you have a life? Can you have and the answer is yes, you can. And it's hard, it's difficult, but with the right kind of support, you can.
Thank you. And we'll definitely get Wayne to capture that properly.
Okay.
I'm going to go to Safia, and she'll be our final question. Safia?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, Safia.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for joining so late. but I did catch a brief glimpse of the conversation between you and Wayne. And I just wanted to touch on this idea about like the transactional aspect and how from a pragmatic view, you're asking people to participate in research, but people in government are asking, well, what's in it for us? And it's a valid question to ask, but how do you go about answering that question? And it stems from a paper that I read a couple of months ago, but I don't want to make the question too convoluted. So I'll let you answer, and then I can just describe what the paper was about that I briefly read that touched on a similar issue.
Absolutely. So great question, Sophia. And the way that we've approached things in Tanzania, in Sickle in Africa, and now, so this was a question that came up even yesterday at the patient forum here at the Hammersmith Hospital, is that as a patient or as a patient community, the question is, well, what's in it for me if I participate in this? Now, the altruistic answer that you're meant to give is that no, the research is for the greater good. And you're donating your sample, you're donating your DNA to create a resource that will then be used to find a cure, etc. That's one aspect of things. Personally, it's not a practical and realistic answer, because at the end of the day, if I want to participate, I need to see somehow, directly or indirectly, the impact that the research is having on me. Because if you are running a program and you've got, I don't know, 10 million pounds to run a program, and you're saying all of this money will only go to the research and will not have an impact on your care, it's not going to be a successful long-term partnership, because one partner, i.e. the patient community or the healthcare providers, will just see this as you, as the academic or the research, just coming to suck out resources from us, and we're not getting anything from it. So the way that I look at it is that you have to have conversations with all the members. What's in it for the patient? Is that in an ideal situation, any research program or activity that comes in will increase resources in that service. So for instance, if previously there used to be only 2 nurses or 1 doctor, the research activity should potentially increase the number of healthcare providers that are there in other settings, pay them better, so that even the service that is being provided is better, because you've increased the number of people, you've increased the quality of the people who are there in terms of quality, job satisfaction on their part, and commitment to kind of provide good care. The other aspect is and this is something that's changing a little bit, in that in some instances, for instance, in research programs in many countries in Africa, is that there's a really practical situation where I need you to come and stay for an hour for the research project, or I need you to come and it's not a clinic day, so you need to come and you're going to spend your time here, you're going to need transport, etc. So there's a way of saying, I will reimburse your transport, or the program or the research study will reimburse your transport or for your time, etc. And I think these are things that need to be looked at in a way that is practical, realistic, and does not translate into coercion, which is something that is important for research to safeguard research participants. I think from a bigger perspective, bigger kind of structural perspective, it's really to ask research organizations or projects or whatever, when they are writing their grants, and when they are, because as a researcher, you also have to deliver on what you said you would do. So sometimes there's that urgency of saying, but then if we are able to say, as part of the process, this is an integrated program, patients are participants, these are questions and issues that will be raised during the development of the program or the project. And therefore, if it's reimbursement for time, reimbursement for travel, compensation for this is something that can be built into the research program. And it's a conversation that has to happen over time. It won't change things immediately, but it needs to start happening now. And I think it's really important for us as researchers or scientists and as patient community, for them to realize that this is a problem that we recognize and we need to work together to kind of address it.
Yeah, I completely agree. The reason I asked that question is because I read a paper a couple of months ago that really opened my eyes to the ethics behind research. And it was titled, "Is there anything else that you would like to add?" And it's about the ethics of not addressing research participants' top concerns in public health emergencies. And what it does is it basically followed this, I forgot what type of, I don't know if it was Pfizer or if it was a different large, big pharma company with lots of money, no doubt. But they went into these countries that were really impacted by Ebola, and they were asking a series of questions that were basically getting people to almost relive the trauma that they went through. And at the very end of the talk that they had with the participants, they wrote an entire paper off of the final question being, "Is there anything else you'd like to ask?" And they like really answered a lot of issues pertaining to, you know, in these regions we had to burn our mattresses, we don't have homes, a lot of it was burnt away, so why can't you help us be provided with some useful and essential furniture that we could live on? Other issues they touched upon include the fact that they described it as a child, if you asked him to go walk to the right, he'll walk to the left, and that's supposed to be denoting the fact that he suffered so much trauma and he has lost both of his parents that he doesn't have any form of emotional support available to him. And you just kind of view him as like a separate entity, and then you'll go back to wherever you came from in terms of your research, and you're so far removed from the issue, but you're so willing to allow people to relive their traumas just because you need to get answers for work. So I do completely agree that more can be done. And I also agree on the fact that you have to be, it's a fine balance, because what you don't want to do is provide like necessities and make them seem like incentives, and then silently coerce people to take up those incentives because the latter isn't good enough to suffer in silence. But I definitely do think that when it comes to research in Africa, like many of these big Western institutions are just so far removed from the issue, they can just almost look at them as like, well, there's an issue over there.
Absolutely. And Sophia, this is not something that is specific to research in Africa. This is across any, this is a fundamental issue that happens anywhere in the world. And it's, if you look at the Black population, which is the one that is in the UK that is predominantly affected by sickle cell disease and other conditions that are very specific or have a high prevalence. These are the issues that happen even here, where you say, I'm not able to get people participating in the research. And some of the reasons is precisely that. A community is disenfranchised, has been under-resourced for many, many years, has had stigma attached to it, has had, and so it's not, and again, this is the importance of us looking at it as together. It's not there in Africa, here in, this is a problem that happens across different countries, continents, levels of, but really good. I'm hoping that we can also touch base and continue on with those conversations. Are you doing this as part of a PhD or as a postdoc?
No.
I'll link the two of you, right?
Okay. No. We'll stop.
I'll link the two of you.
We'll catch up later, Sophia. Thanks.
No worries. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to ask my final question then. Sophia, thank you for that question. All right, my final two questions, my double headers, and it's, it's been fascinating hearing your story, right? But I'm going to ask two questions. What advice would you give to your 16-year-old self, your younger self, on what they could expect going through life or whatever? And then the flip side to that is to ask the question, what would your younger self look at you now and say, wow? Okay, so those are the two questions, right?
So I'm 53 years old. I was 53 2 weeks ago.
Oh, happy birthday, belatedly.
So what would it's an interesting, I think as looking, I don't know, I'll answer it both, is that I just feel very, very lucky to be doing what I do, because I'm doing what I love. And I think that's something that as a 16-year-old, I would look and I would just say, I'm just so glad and it wasn't a straight line, it was not straightforward, but I'm glad that I'm doing things that I love. And I think this is really important, because it means that when I get frustrated, whether it's with my scientific career, my professional career, or my medical career, when I get frustrated, as a doctor, with patients or with the healthcare system, I go back and I tell myself, why am I doing this? And when you're doing it because you love it, you love what you're doing. I think that's a privilege, and I think that's something that I do. And again, going back to how I did that when I was 16, or at different stages, including now, thinking, what do I want to do for the next 2 years or 6 months that I'm here at Imperial? It's really to say, I know what I don't want to do, and the things that I will do are the things that I keep going back to, and I keep, and so I do think that if you are able to find something that drives you, that you're passionate about, don't be distracted. I think that's what I would tell myself. Don't be distracted by, oh, this is not an interesting thing, or this is not of value. If it's important for you, please do it. That's what I would tell myself. And I think if I use that to a certain extent, just driving you forward, I think that is something that is helpful. You'll make mistakes, and I think that's the other thing that I would tell my 16-year-old self, or is to say that you will make mistakes, and it will take longer than you anticipated, and you may have to do it over and over again. But if it's something that's worth doing, just do it, even if it's really, really difficult. And I think the other thing, is that talking to people about it and learning from people, understanding how things happen for others, both the good things and the bad things, it's really valuable. I mean, I am, when I lose a patient, or one of the things that it's still something that I struggle with, but then the thing that I try and tell myself is that what is the legacy, or how can we I don't know, what's the word, how can we cherish the life of a person who has died? It's by making his or her life worth something, so that we can say 5 years from now, we changed this because patient X died, or patient X suffered, and I think that's something that I wish I had done more of throughout my career. Kind of just, obviously you have to be careful, because you can upset a lot of people, you can upset a lot of systems, but it's really reminding yourself that I'm doing this for patients, for individuals. I'm doing this because,
know your purpose. Yeah, brilliant. Julie, it has been absolutely brilliant. I knew it would be. I've been chasing you for months since New York, but it's been absolutely brilliant having this conversation. And you've been the discussion about sense of belonging and being pragmatic, but at the same time, being compassionate as you go along, in looking for the similarities, not always looking for differences, and looking how we can move forward and not necessarily focusing on the barriers which are preventing us from moving forward. I think you articulated that beautifully, and I know we're going to have many more conversations that I have no doubt, right? But we want to just continue to encourage you and to say we're here to support you from the Imperial community as you continue to do your visiting professorship here with us. And it's an absolute privilege to have you here with us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
I'm going to just share with everyone what's going on for the next session, and then we'll be heading off. So next time we're going to have Professor Robert Merkea, and he is a professor of chemistry at the University of Nottingham, and he's also the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global Engagement at Nottingham University. It's a fascinating story that he has as well. And if you have missed any of the other interviews, then please go to our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO, and you'll be able to hear some of those interviews. I'm going to just quickly move on to say, you know, as I say every week, it's because of the generosity, it's because of people sharing their experiences and being willing to share their experiences that we get an insight into what it actually means for everyone to belong. So please keep coming back, please keep sharing your stories, and please keep listening, and let's make a difference. Let's make it a legacy. So until next week, or until September, we are now on break until the beginning of September. Enjoy your summer, and I will see you back in September. So thanks, everybody. All right. Just stop the recording.